The news broke like a thunderclap across the continent. Interpol had issued an arrest warrant for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional president of Burkina Faso. Within hours, headlines ricocheted from Ouagadougou to Johannesburg, from Paris to Washington. But what was meant to be a decisive blow against a controversial leader quickly morphed into something else entirely. A global backlash that exposed the fault lines of international power, post-colonial tension, and Africa's fight for sovereignty. Traoré, a 36-year-old army captain who seized power in a coup in 2022, had already become a polarizing figure. To some, he was a symbol of resistance, a leader who dared to reject Western influence and chart a new course for his nation. To others, he was a destabilizing force, accused of authoritarianism and reckless diplomacy. But regardless of where one stood, the Interpol warrant was a dramatic escalation. The warrant itself was shrouded in ambiguity. No official statement from Interpol detailed the charges, and speculation ran rampant. Was it related to alleged human rights abuses? Financial misconduct? Or was it, as many suspected, a politically motivated move orchestrated by powerful nations threatened by Traoré's growing influence? Social media erupted. Hashtags like #HandSoftRare and #AfricaUnites began trending within hours. In Mali, protesters took to the streets, waving Burkinabe flags and chanting slogans of solidarity. In Niger, youth groups organized forums to discuss the implications of the warrant. Across the continent, the message was clear: this was not just about one man. It was about Africa's right to self-determination. The backlash wasn't limited to the streets. Intellectuals, journalists, and political analysts weighed in, dissecting the warrant's timing and implications. Many pointed to Traoré's recent moves, expelling French troops, strengthening ties with Russia, and nationalizing key resources as potential triggers. This is a classic case of empire striking back, wrote one columnist in a Pan-African journal. Traoré dared to challenge the status quo, and now he's being punished. But the warrant did more than spark outrage. It galvanized a movement. Suddenly, Traoré was no longer just a national leader. He was a symbol of resistance against neo-colonialism, of defiance in the face of global pressure, of a continent refusing to be bullied. And that symbolism proved powerful. In Burkina Faso, the government responded swiftly. Officials denounced the warrant as illegitimate and politically motivated. State media ran segments highlighting Traoré's achievements, framing him as a patriot under siege. The narrative was clear. This was an attack not just on Traoré, but on the nation itself. International reactions were mixed. France and the United States expressed concern, calling for transparency and adherence to international law. Russia, meanwhile, condemned the warrant and pledged support for Traoré. China remained silent, while regional bodies like ECOWAS issued cautious statements urging dialogue. But perhaps the most striking response came from ordinary Africans. In interviews, many expressed frustration with what they saw as a double standard. Why is it that African leaders who stand up for their people are always targeted? Asked a university student in Ghana. But those who sell us out are celebrated? This sentiment echoed across borders. The warrant, intended to isolate Traoré, had instead united people in outrage. It had backfired spectacularly. And yet, beneath the surface, deeper questions lingered. What does this moment reveal about the nature of international justice? About the role of institutions like Interpol? About the balance of power in a world still shaped by colonial legacies? For many, the answers were unsettling. Interpol, while ostensibly neutral, had long been accused of being used as a tool by powerful nations. Critics pointed to past cases where warrants were issued against dissidents, whistleblowers, and political opponents, often at the behest of regimes with questionable records. The Traoré case, they argued, fit this pattern. Others saw the warrant as a wake-up call, a reminder that Africa's path to true independence would be fraught with challenges, that leaders who dared to break the mold would face resistance, not just from within, but from without, and that unity, more than ever, was essential. As the days passed, the controversy deepened. New reports emerged suggesting that the warrant may have been based on dubious intelligence. Analysts questioned the legal basis, pointing out that Interpol does not have the authority to arrest heads of state without clear evidence and international consensus. The lack of transparency only fueled suspicion. Meanwhile, Traoré remained defiant. In a televised address, he dismissed the warrant as a desperate act by those who fear Africa's awakening. He vowed to continue his reforms, to strengthen ties with allies who respected Burkina Faso's sovereignty, and to resist any attempt to undermine his leadership. His words resonated. Across Africa, people shared clips of the speech, praising his courage and conviction. In Senegal, a youth group organized a Traoré Solidarity Day, featuring music, poetry, and political discussions. In Kenya, a university hosted a panel on the politics of resistance, lessons from Burkina Faso. The warrant had become more than a legal document. It was a catalyst, a spark that ignited conversations, mobilized movements, and challenged assumptions. And in doing so, it revealed the power of narrative, the ability of a single event to reshape perceptions, to inspire action, to redefine what is possible. By the end of the week, the global media had shifted its tone. Initial reports focused on the warrant itself, its implications, and the controversy. But now, the story was about the backlash, about the protests, the solidarity, the symbolism, about how a continent had turned a moment of crisis into a rallying cry. And so, what began as an attempt to silence a leader had instead amplified his voice. What was meant to isolate him had instead connected him to millions. What was intended as a warning had become a declaration that Africa would no longer be dictated to, no longer be silenced, no longer be ignored. To understand why the Interpol warrant against Ibrahim Traoré triggered such a visceral reaction, one must look beyond the immediate headlines and into the deeper historical currents that shape West Africa's political landscape. This wasn't just about one man. It was about centuries of foreign interference, broken promises, and a continent's long struggle to reclaim its agency. Burkina Faso, formerly known as Upper Volta, has long been a battleground for competing interests. Since gaining independence from France in 1960, the country has experienced multiple coups, foreign-backed regimes, and economic dependency. The legacy of colonialism didn't vanish, it simply evolved. Aid became leverage. Military bases became footholds, and leaders who resisted the status quo often found themselves isolated or removed. Traoré's rise to power was emblematic of a new wave of leadership sweeping across the Sahel. Young, assertive, and unapologetically Pan-African, he represented a break from the old guard. His rhetoric was bold. Burkina Faso would no longer be a pawn in global games. His policies reflected that stance, expelling French troops, rejecting Western aid with strings attached, and forging new alliances with countries like Russia and Turkey. These moves didn't go unnoticed. Western capitals viewed them with alarm, interpreting Traoré's pivot as a threat to regional stability and their strategic interests. But within Africa, many saw it as long overdue courage. A leader finally putting his people first, even at great personal risk. The Interpol warrant, then, was seen not in isolation but as part of a pattern. A familiar script where leaders who challenge global power structures are swiftly targeted. The timing was suspicious. Just weeks earlier, Traoré had announced plans to nationalize key mining operations, many of which were owned by foreign companies. Days before the warrant, he had hosted a summit with other Sahel leaders to discuss forming a regional security alliance independent of Western oversight. To many observers, the message was clear: Traoré was stepping out of line, and the warrant was a warning. But the backlash revealed how much the narrative had shifted. In the past, such actions might have led to quiet compliance or diplomatic retreat. This time, the response was defiance. Not just from Traoré, but from a growing chorus of voices across Africa. In Bamako, Mali's capital, government officials issued a statement condemning the warrant and expressing solidarity with Burkina Faso. "We stand with our brother nation against external interference," it read. In Niamey, Niger's transitional government echoed the sentiment, calling the warrant an affront to African sovereignty. Even beyond the Sahel, the ripple effects were felt. In South Africa, political parties debated the implications of the warrant in parliament. In Nigeria, civil society groups organized teach-ins on the history of foreign intervention. In Ethiopia, state media ran documentaries on Pan-Africanism and the legacy of resistance. The warrant had inadvertently sparked a continental reckoning. And it wasn't just governments reacting. Artists, musicians, and influencers joined the conversation. A popular rapper in Senegal released a track titled Traoré, blending traditional rhythms with lyrics about freedom and resistance. In Cameroon, a filmmaker announced a documentary project exploring the warrant's impact. Across TikTok and Instagram, creators posted videos dissecting the situation, drawing parallels to past injustices, and urging unity. This cultural response was powerful. It transformed the warrant from a legal issue into a symbol of struggle. It gave voice to frustrations that had long simmered beneath the surface, about exploitation, about double standards, about the need for African solutions to African problems. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the government doubled down. Traoré's administration launched a media campaign highlighting his achievements, improved security in rural areas, increased investment in agriculture, and expanded access to education. Billboards across Ouagadougou featured his image alongside slogans like "Our Future," "Our Choice," and "Burkina Faso Stands Tall." The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. In interviews, citizens expressed pride in their leader's stance. "He's not perfect," said one shopkeeper, "but he's fighting for us. That's more than most have done." But beneath the surface, tensions remained. The warrant had created uncertainty. Would Traoré face travel restrictions? Would foreign aid be cut? Would international pressure intensify? His government moved quickly to reassure the public. Officials announced new trade deals with non-Western partners, unveiled plans for regional cooperation, and emphasized their commitment to transparency. "We will not be intimidated," said the foreign minister in a televised interview. Burkina Faso belongs to its people, not to foreign powers. This assertiveness resonated. Across Africa, leaders and citizens alike began re-evaluating their relationships with global institutions. Was Interpol truly neutral? Were international laws applied fairly? Or were they tools of influence, wielded selectively? These questions weren't new, but the Traoré case brought them into sharp focus. It forced a conversation about justice, sovereignty, and the future of African governance. And it wasn't just Africa asking these questions. In Europe, some lawmakers expressed concern about the warrant's implications. A member of the European Parliament called for an inquiry into Interpol's procedures, citing the need for accountability. In the United States, think tanks published reports analyzing the backlash and its potential impact on foreign policy. The warrant had become a global issue. Yet through it all, Traoré remained remarkably composed. In public appearances, he spoke calmly, emphasizing unity and resilience. He avoided inflammatory rhetoric, instead focusing on his vision for Burkina Faso. "We are building something new," he said in one speech. "It will not be easy, but it will be ours." His words struck a chord. They reflected a broader yearning, not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa, for leadership that was bold, principled, and rooted in the people's aspirations. And so, the warrant, intended to weaken Traoré, had instead strengthened his position. It had exposed the fragility of international legitimacy, the power of narrative, and the deep hunger for change. By the end of the month, the story had evolved. Media outlets that once focused on the warrant now explored its consequences. Analysts debated its impact on regional politics. Scholars examined its historical parallels. And citizens, empowered by the discourse, began imagining new possibilities. Could this be a turning point? A moment when Africa reclaims its voice? When leaders are judged not by foreign standards, but by their commitment to their people? The answers remain uncertain. But one thing is clear: the warrant backfired. Not just tactically, but symbolically. It revealed the limits of external control, the strength of collective identity, and the enduring power of resistance. And in doing so, it reminded the world that Africa is not passive. It is watching, thinking, and ready to act. As the dust settled around the Interpol warrant, a new reality began to take shape, one that extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The incident had cracked open a global conversation about African leadership, legitimacy, and the power of perception. And at the heart of it all was a man who, just months earlier, had been dismissed by many as a temporary figure in a long line of transitional presidents. Now, Ibrahim Traoré was being studied in foreign policy circles, debated in university classrooms, and invoked in protest chants. His name had become shorthand for a broader movement, one that questioned the foundations of international order and demanded a new kind of respect for African agency. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to reassess their Sahel strategies. Analysts who once viewed Traoré as a short-term disruptor now acknowledged his staying power. He's not just surviving, one report noted. He's redefining the rules. In Paris, diplomatic cables revealed concern over France's waning influence in its former colonies. The warrant, intended to reinforce control, had instead exposed vulnerability. But perhaps the most profound shift was psychological. For decades, African youth had grown up under the shadow of foreign dominance, economic, cultural, and political. Leaders were often seen as puppets, beholden to external interests. The idea of true sovereignty felt distant, even mythical. Traoré's defiance changed that. Suddenly, here was a leader who spoke plainly, acted boldly, and refused to play by the old rules. He didn't couch his decisions in diplomatic jargon or seek approval from global powers. He made moves that were unapologetically nationalistic, and he did so with clarity and conviction. This authenticity resonated deeply. In interviews across the continent, young people expressed admiration not just for Traoré's policies, but for his posture. "He walks like he owns the land," said a student in Uganda. "That's how a leader should be." In Zambia, a youth activist described him as the first president I've seen who doesn't flinch. The impact was contagious. In Ghana, student unions began organizing forums on political independence. In Tanzania, youth-led podcasts dissected the warrant and its implications. Across Africa, a new generation was awakening, not just to the realities of global power, but to the possibilities of resistance. Civil society organizations also took note. Groups that had long advocated for transparency and accountability began to reframe their work. The warrant had exposed the need for stronger regional institutions, better legal frameworks, and more robust protections for leaders who challenged global norms. In response, coalitions formed. Pan-African legal networks began drafting proposals for an independent continental justice system, one that could adjudicate disputes without external interference. Media watchdogs launched campaigns to monitor international reporting on African affairs, highlighting bias and misinformation. Cultural organizations curated exhibitions on historical resistance, drawing parallels between past heroes and present-day figures like Traoré. This surge of activity wasn't just reactive. It was visionary. The warrant had inadvertently sparked a renaissance, a moment of introspection, innovation, and ambition. Africa wasn't just defending itself. It was imagining a future on its own terms. And yet, the challenges remained. Traoré's stance had made him enemies. Intelligence reports suggested increased surveillance by foreign agencies. Economic sanctions were rumored. Diplomatic isolation loomed. The pressure was mounting. But Traoré seemed prepared. His administration accelerated efforts to diversify partnerships, strengthen internal resilience, and deepen regional ties. Trade agreements with Brazil and India were signed. Joint military exercises with Mali and Niger were announced. Infrastructure projects funded by non-Western allies were unveiled. These moves sent a clear message. Burkina Faso would not be cornered. Still, the stakes were high. The warrant had created a precedent. If Interpol could be used to target a sitting head of state, what did that mean for other leaders? Could any act of defiance be criminalized? Was sovereignty negotiable? These questions haunted policy circles. In Addis Ababa, the African Union convened an emergency session to discuss the warrant's implications. Delegates debated the need for reform, the risks of external manipulation, and the importance of solidarity. While no formal resolution was passed, the tone was unmistakable. Africa was watching, and it would not remain silent. Meanwhile, global media continued to evolve. Initial coverage had focused on the warrant's legality and Traoré's alleged misconduct. But as the backlash grew, narratives shifted. Journalists began exploring the historical context, the regional dynamics, and the symbolism of resistance. Documentaries were commissioned. Op-eds proliferated. The story had become too complex to ignore. And in this complexity, Traoré thrived. He understood the power of narrative, the ability to shape perception, to inspire loyalty, to build momentum. His speeches became more frequent, more strategic. He spoke not just to Burkinabe citizens, but to Africans everywhere. "We are not alone," he said in one address. "Our struggle is shared. Our future is collective." These words echoed across borders. In Rwanda, A youth leader quoted them during a rally. In Liberia, a radio host played the clip before a panel discussion. In Algeria, graffiti artists painted murals with the phrase, "The warrant," had become a rallying point, not just against injustice, but for unity. And yet, beneath the celebration, there was caution. Traoré's rise had exposed vulnerabilities in international law, in regional cohesion, in media integrity. The backlash had revealed strength, but also fragility. The path forward would require more than defiance. It would demand strategy, collaboration, and vision. In response, intellectuals began drafting manifestos. Scholars published essays on post-colonial governance. Activists proposed new models of accountability. The conversation was evolving from reaction to reconstruction. And through it all, Traoré remained central, not as a flawless hero, but as a catalyst, a figure who, by standing firm, had forced the world to reconsider its assumptions. By the end of the quarter, the warrant's impact was undeniable. Burkina Faso's economy had stabilized. Regional alliances had strengthened. Public support had surged. And globally, the discourse had shifted. What began as a legal maneuver had become a political earthquake. And in its wake, a new landscape was emerging, one defined not by fear, but by possibility. The legal dimensions of the Interpol warrant against Ibrahim Traoré quickly became a focal point for scholars and practitioners alike. On paper, Interpol is a neutral organization designed to facilitate international police cooperation and combat transnational crime. But in practice, its mechanisms have often been criticized for susceptibility to political manipulation. The Red Notice system, essentially a request to locate and provisionally arrest an individual pending extradition, has been used in the past to target dissidents, journalists, and political opponents. Traoré's case fit uneasily into this pattern. No formal charges were disclosed. No evidence was presented publicly. And crucially, no consensus among member states was reached. The opacity of the process raised alarms. Legal experts questioned whether the warrant violated Interpol's own constitution, which prohibits involvement in political, military, religious, or racial matters. In Geneva, human rights lawyers filed a petition demanding an independent review of the warrant. In The Hague, international law professors convened a symposium titled Justice or Geopolitics: The Case of Ibrahim Traoré. The consensus was clear. The warrant lacked transparency, and its timing suggested ulterior motives. This legal ambiguity fed into a broader critique of global institutions. For years, African leaders and activists had argued that bodies like the UN, IMF, and Interpol were structurally biased, designed to serve the interests of powerful nations while marginalizing others. The Traoré warrant became Exhibit A, and media coverage played a pivotal role. In Western outlets, initial reports framed Traoré as a rogue leader, accused of undermining democracy and destabilizing the region. But as the backlash grew, the tone shifted. Investigative pieces began probing the warrant's origins, questioning its legitimacy, and highlighting the broader geopolitical context. In African media, the framing was starkly different. Traoré was portrayed as a patriot, targeted for standing up to neo-colonial powers. Editorials lambasted the warrant as an affront to sovereignty. Talk shows dissected the implications for regional unity. Documentaries explored the history of foreign intervention in Burkina Faso. This divergence in framing underscored a deeper truth. Narratives are not neutral. They are shaped by interests, ideologies, and power structures. And in the age of social media, those narratives can be challenged, reframed, and amplified in real time. Traoré's supporters understood this well. His communications team launched a digital campaign to counter misinformation, share his speeches, and highlight his achievements. Hashtags like #TraorTruth and #JusticeForBurkina began trending. Influencers across Africa posted videos explaining the warrant's flaws and celebrating Traoré's defiance. The result was a media ecosystem that no longer relied solely on traditional outlets. Citizen journalism flourished. Podcasts, YouTube channels, and TikTok accounts became primary sources of information. And in this decentralized landscape, the warrant's narrative was flipped on its head. But the implications went beyond media. The warrant became a case study in global power dynamics, a moment that revealed how legal tools could be weaponized, how narratives could be contested, and how resistance could be mobilized. In academic circles, the case sparked new research. Political scientists examined the warrant's impact on regional alliances. Sociologists studied its effect on youth mobilization. Legal scholars proposed reforms to prevent future misuse of international mechanisms. And in policy circles, the lessons were clear. For Western governments, the warrant's backlash highlighted the risks of unilateral action. For African governments, it underscored the importance of solidarity and strategic communication. For global institutions, it exposed the need for transparency, accountability, and reform. Meanwhile, Traoré continued to govern. His administration remained focused on domestic priorities, improving infrastructure, expanding education, and enhancing security. But the warrant had changed the stakes. Every decision was now scrutinized through a global lens. Every speech was analyzed for its geopolitical implications. This pressure was both a burden and an opportunity. Traoré could no longer operate in isolation. But he also had a platform, a chance to articulate a vision not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa as a whole. And he seized that chance. In a landmark address to the Pan-African Parliament, Traoré spoke of unity, dignity, and self-determination. He called for a new era of cooperation, rooted in mutual respect and shared values. He proposed the creation of an African legal consortium to review international warrants and protect leaders from politically motivated persecution. The speech was met with applause and action. Delegates from multiple countries pledged support. Legal experts offered to draft proposals. Civil society groups began lobbying for implementation. The warrant had sparked not just outrage, but innovation. And this innovation extended to education. Universities across Africa introduced new courses on international law, media literacy, and Pan-Africanism. Students studied the Traoré case as a real-time example of resistance and reform. Professors encouraged critical thinking, debate, and activism. In Burkina Faso, the impact was especially profound. Enrollment in political science programs surged. Youth organizations flourished. Public discourse became more engaged, more informed, more ambitious. The warrant had inadvertently catalyzed a civic awakening. And globally, the ripple effects continued. In Latin America, activists drew parallels to their own struggles against foreign interference. In Asia, scholars examined the warrant's implications for regional autonomy. In Europe, progressive politicians called for reforms to ensure that international institutions served all nations equally. The warrant had become a mirror, reflecting the imbalances of global power, the resilience of resistance, and the possibilities of change. And through it all, Traoré remained a symbol, not of perfection, but of principle, not of victory, but of vision. His story was still unfolding. The challenges were still immense. But the message was clear. Africa would no longer be silent. It would speak, act, and lead. Months after the warrant was issued, its reverberations continued to shape discourse across continents. What began as a procedural action had evolved into a defining moment, not just for Ibrahim Traoré, but for the global understanding of African sovereignty and resistance. The warrant had failed in its immediate objective, but its unintended consequences were far more profound. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's popularity remained high. His administration had weathered the storm, strengthened regional alliances, and deepened domestic reforms. Infrastructure projects were underway, rural security had improved, and educational initiatives were expanding. The country was far from perfect, but it was moving, deliberately, defiantly, toward a future shaped by its own priorities. And Traoré himself had grown into the role. No longer just a transitional figure, he had become a statesman. His speeches were studied, his policies debated, his leadership emulated. He had emerged not just as a national leader, but as a continental symbol, one whose defiance had exposed the fragility of global power and the strength of collective identity. Across Africa, the warrant had sparked a renaissance of thought. Intellectuals revisited the writings of Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Patrice Lumumba. Their visions of unity, dignity, and self-determination found new relevance. Universities hosted conferences on post-colonial governance. Artists painted murals of resistance. Musicians composed anthems of pride. This cultural awakening was matched by political recalibration. Regional bodies began exploring mechanisms to protect leaders from politically motivated international actions. Legal frameworks were proposed to ensure due process and transparency. Diplomatic protocols were revised to prioritize sovereignty and solidarity. And civil society flourished. Youth organizations expanded their reach, advocating for civic education, media literacy, and political engagement. Journalists pushed for more nuanced coverage of African affairs. Activists demanded accountability, not just from foreign powers, but from their own governments. The warrant had become a catalyst. It had exposed weaknesses, yes, but it had also revealed strengths. It had shown that Africa was not monolithic, not passive, not peripheral. It was diverse, dynamic, and determined. Globally, the lessons were sobering. Western governments faced criticism for their role in the warrant's issuance and their failure to anticipate the backlash. Think tanks revised their models, acknowledging the limits of influence and the importance of legitimacy. International institutions began internal reviews, seeking to restore trust and credibility. And in the media, the narrative had shifted permanently. No longer could African leaders be reduced to caricatures. No longer could international actions be taken without scrutiny. The warrant had forced a reckoning, with bias, with power, with history. But perhaps the most enduring impact was psychological. For generations, African youth had been told to temper their expectations, to accept the status quo, to defer to external authority. The warrant shattered that illusion. It showed that resistance was possible, that leadership could be bold, that sovereignty could be reclaimed. In classrooms, students debated the ethics of international law. In communities, elders shared stories of past struggles. In cities, murals of Traoré stood alongside those of Sankara and Nkrumah. The message was clear: Africa remembers, Africa resists, Africa rises. And yet, the road ahead remains complex. Traoré's defiance has inspired many, but it has also raised questions. How can Africa protect its leaders without enabling impunity? How can it assert sovereignty while maintaining global cooperation? How can it build unity without erasing diversity? These questions demand thoughtful answers. They require dialogue, innovation, and courage. But the warrant has created space for that conversation, a space where Africa can speak on its own terms, define its own future, and challenge the structures that have long constrained it. In the end, the Interpol warrant against Ibrahim Traoré did not achieve its intended goal. It did not isolate him, weaken his position, or silence his voice. Instead, it amplified his message, united his supporters, and transformed him into a symbol of resistance. And in doing so, it reminded the world of a simple truth. Power is not just about institutions. It is about people, their stories, their struggles, their dreams. And when those people stand together, even the most powerful systems can be challenged. Traoré's story is still unfolding. The challenges remain immense. The pressures are real. But the legacy of this moment, the defiance, the unity, the awakening, will endure. Because this was never just about one man. It was about a continent reclaiming its voice. About a people refusing to be defined by others. About a future that belongs, finally, to those who live it.